For most of its history, Korea was a single country, one peninsula, one people, one culture stretching back thousands of years. That changed in the final days of the Second World War, in a decision made hastily by two exhausted superpowers who were already beginning to destruct each other, and who gave almost no thought to what the Korean people themselves might want. In August 1945, Japan surrendered and its empire collapsed. Japan had occupied Korea for 35 years, ruling it with an iron grip. Koreans were forbidden from using their own language in schools, forced to adopt Japanese names, and conscripted into Japanese factories and military units. The occupation had been one of the systematic cultural erasure and economic extraction. When it ended, Korea was suddenly free for the first time in a generation, but the question of who would fill the void was answered not by Koreans, but by the two most powerful nations on Earth. The Soviet Union, which had entered the Pacific War in its final days, moved its forces into the northern half of Korea. The United States, which had been fighting Japan across the Pacific for 4 years, moved its forces into the southern half. The dividing line was chosen in a matter of hours by American military planners working from a National Geographic map. They settled on the 38th parallel, a line running roughly across the middle of the country, with the understanding that this was a short-term arrangement until a proper government could be established and elections held. That temporary line became permanent, and the permanent line eventually became a war. The world in 1945 was rapidly splitting into two opposing camps. On one side was the United States, the wealthiest and most powerful nation on Earth, committed to capitalism and democratic government. On the other was the Soviet Union, which had emerged from war as an enormous military power and was committed to spreading communism. These two countries had been uneasy allies during the war against Germany and Japan. Now that the common enemy was gone, the alliance fell apart almost immediately. This rivalry, known as the Cold War, shaped everything that happened in Korea. In the north, the Soviet Union helped install a government run by a hardline communist who had spent years fighting as a guerrilla against the Japanese occupation. He was a true believer in the communist cause, deeply nationalist, and utterly committed to reunifying the entire peninsula under his rule. In the south, the United States backed a different leader, a Korean who had spent decades living in exile, was fiercely anti-communist, and was equally committed to ruling the entire peninsula himself. Both men claimed to be a legitimate leader of all of Korea. Both governments refused to recognize the other. The 38th parallel was supposed to be a temporary administrative line. It became a heavily armed border between two hostile states, which convinced the other had no right to exist. Through the late 1940s, the situation grew increasingly tense. Both sides conducted raids across the border. Both governments carried out brutal crackdowns on political opponents within their own territory. The North executed landlords and purged anyone seen as a class enemy. The South violently suppressed left-wing movements, labor organizers, and anyone suspected of communist sympathies. Tens of thousands of people on both sides lost their lives in their period before the formal war even began. The 38th parallel was already a violent place long before June 1950. The North was building towards something much bigger. It had been quietly receiving shipments of Soviet tanks, artillery, and military equipment. Its army was being trained and organized into a formidable conventional military force. Many of its soldiers had combat experience, having fought against Japan or alongside communist forces in China during the Chinese Civil War that had just ended with a communist victory in 1949. The North was preparing not just to defend itself, but to conquer. On June 25, 1950, at 4 a.m, that preparation became action. North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in overwhelming strength. It was not a skirmish or a raid. It was a full-scale military invasion, with tanks leading the way and infantry divisions following behind. The Southern military, which had been equipped by the United States for eternal security rather than conventional warfare, had no tanks and almost no capacity to stop an armored advance. It collapsed rapidly. Within 3 days, the southern capital had fallen. Within weeks, the North had overrun almost the entire peninsula. pushing the remaining southern forces and small number of American troops into a tiny pocket in the far southeast corner of the country. The speed of the collapse shocked the world. The United States had not expected this. Just days before the invasion, a senior American official had publicly listed the countries the United States would defend in Asia, and Korea was not on the list. Whether the North took this as a green light has been debated ever since. What is certain is that once the invasion happened, the American response was swift and decisive, though for reasons that had less to do with Korea itself and more to do with what Korea represented. The world had just watched China fall to communism the previous year. The Soviet Union had tested its first nuclear weapon in 1949. Now a communist army was overrunning an American-backed government in Asia. American leaders were convinced that if they did not respond, the message to the rest of the world would be that communist aggression went unanswered. That could not be allowed. The United States pushed a resolution through the United Nations Security Council authorizing military force to repel the invasion. This was only possible because the Soviet Union had been boycotting the council for months in a dispute over whether China's seat on the council should belong to the new communist government or the old one that had fled to the island of Taiwan. By walking out of the room, the Soviet Union accidentally handed the United States the votes it needed. Within days, American troops were being rushed to Korea. Eventually, 16 countries contributed forces under the United Nations banner, though the vast majority of the non-Korean troops were American. The early weeks were desperate. American and South Korean forces were pushed back to the southeastern corner of the peninsula, defending the shrinking perimeter around a port city. Supply lines were stretched thin. The troops were undertrained, under-equipped, and facing a battle-hardened enemy with momentum on its side. They held on, barely, as reinforcements and equipment poured in by sea. Then came one of the most daring military operations of the 20th century. Rather than simply pushing north from the southern perimeter, United Nations forces launched a massive amphibious landing on the western coast of Korea. It was an extraordinarily risky maneuver. The ties at the landing site were among the most extreme in the world. The harbor was heavily fortified, and the window for operation was extremely narrow. Military experts thought it would border on reckless. It worked brilliantly. North Korean forces, suddenly cut off from their supply lines and facing attack from the south and from behind, collapsed. The United Nations forces broke out from the southern perimeter and linked up with forces that had landed in the west. The North's army was shattered, thousands of soldiers were captured, the rest fled north. Within weeks, the United Nations forces had not only recaptured the south, they had crossed the 38th parallel and were driving deep into North Korea. The original goal of simply restoring the border had shifted, of reunifying the entire peninsula under the southern government, of wiping out the northern state entirely. It was an intoxicating moment. It was also a catastrophic miscalculation. China had been watching events on the Korean peninsula with deep alarm. The two countries shared a border. The idea of a hostile, American-backed military force reaching that border was not something China was willing to accept. It issued warnings through diplomatic backchannels that were dismissed or ignored. Then, in late October 1950, as the United Nations forces pushed toward the northern border with China, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers crossed into Korea under cover of night, moving without radios to avoid detection. The effect was devastating. United Nations forces, spread thin across freezing mountainous terrain and not expecting a full Chinese intervention, were suddenly facing an enemy of staggering size appearing from all directions at once. They were pushed back in some of the most brutal fighting of the entire war, in temperatures that plunged to minus 30 degrees, through mountain passes where frostbite was as dangerous as combat. Entire units were encircled and had to fight their way out. The advance into the north collapsed entirely. The front line stabilized roughly back near where it all had started, the 38th parallel. The war then entered its longest and most grinding phase. For 2 more years, the two sides faced each other across heavily fortified lines that barely moved. Negotiations began in 1951, but stalled repeatedly. One of the central disputes was what to do with prisoners of war specifically. Tens of thousands of North Korean and Chinese prisoners who said they did not want to be sent home. Neither side could agree on terms. Meanwhile, soldiers continued to lose their lives in battles over hills and ridge lines that had no names, only numbers. trading the same ground back and forth for marginal tactical advantage that ultimately meant nothing. An armistice agreement was finally signed in July 1953, not a peace treaty, but a ceasefire. The border between North and South was set almost exactly where it had been before the war began, tracing a jagged line close to the 38th parallel. A demilitarized zone roughly 2.5 miles wide was established on either side of the line, emptied of civilians and packed with landmines. Prisoners were exchanged, the guns went quiet. Nothing else was resolved. No peace treaty was ever signed. The two Koreas remained technically at war. The North sealed itself off from the world and descended into an increasingly extreme form of authoritarian rule, becoming one of the most isolated and repressive states on Earth. The South, with continued American support and investment, rebuilt itself and eventually transformed into one of the most successful economies in Asia. The war claimed the lives of somewhere between 3 and 5 million people, soldiers and civilians combined from all sides. It pulled the United States and China into direct military conflict for the first time, a confrontation that would poison relations between the two countries for decades. It locked an entire people into a division that no one who imposed it ever expected to last, and that has never been undone. It began with a line drawn hastily on a map by two foreign powers working from a National Geographic atlas. In a matter of hours, without consulting a single Korean, it ended with the same line, reinforced with concrete and barbed wire and decades of hostility, still standing.